Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
37% of the way through their buying or their procurement phase, they go through what is called a due diligence phase. And they're learning, they're educating, they're doing all these things that we're talking about, but they're also defining what their own problem is. And this is when they start painting their box.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast. I say that every episode, and I probably will continue to say it every episode, even though there's not going to be another host coming anytime soon, so I could probably cut it out. On today's show, we have Reni, Senior Director of Sales at Consensus, and we're getting practical. We're getting practitioner-led on this episode, which is something I want to do more of in future episodes as well. And we're diving into the concept and the process and how to deal with having more than one decision maker in the buying cycle, in the buying process. It's happening all over B2B sales. It's getting more and more complex, and Jake gives us some really good insights in this show of how we can deal with it. You can find out more about Jake and everything that the company he works for does over at goconsensus.com. And with that all said, let's jump into today's episode. Hey Jake, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Hey, thank you, Will. It's great to be here.
You're more than welcome, sir. Today we're going to dive into a topic which is well, you can tell me in a second whether it's becoming more and more common, but I feel it is. And that is whether the concept and the ideas behind B2B sales is becoming more complex. There's more decision makers, there's more people involved. And so I want to get your thoughts, insights on this and how we can take advantage of this when our competition perhaps has been slow to respond to this change. But get us started off. Is this a trend that is happening? Is B2B sales becoming more complex? And because this is a gut feeling on mine as opposed to any data that I've seen, is this a trend that is really happening out there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would maybe phrase it a little differently. I wouldn't say necessarily that B2B sales is getting more complex. B2B sales has always been complex, especially in the enterprise space. It's always been a long process. What is changing is the B2B sales is getting, in some way, it's requiring a different approach and understanding the way that your businesses have changed and are starting to procure differently and evaluate differently and do due diligence differently and learn differently. That to me is the change. I wouldn't necessarily say it's more complex, it's different, and that requires us to adjust to meet the complexity that's always been there.
Okay, then. To get a level deeper in this, I think this is really useful for the Salesman Podcast audience. I feel that any opportunity I've got to widen people's business acronym so we can talk about sales on a wider context is useful. Why has procurement changed? Why has this procurement process and then the process of due diligence, I think the word you used then, why has that changed over the past few years?
Yeah. So the other thing I'd also add too is the one part I feel that has actually changed in complexity is the mid-market SMB sell. And that is only because you have rapid growth of a lot of mid-market companies that have a lot of infusion of funds that we haven't necessarily seen always in definitely the tech space. And so you're seeing a more mature procurement process in the mid-market space than maybe you've seen in the past. So that is definitely an area where I would say there's a complexity change. But to go back to the question you just asked, the reason why I think that it's changed is because the sheer amount of information that's available to your buyer today is completely different than it was even 5-10 years ago, right? The way that the sales process may have worked in the past is that the buyer needed to learn from somewhere. And if they couldn't access all the information online, they would reach out to the seller or the vendors pretty early on in the process. During a stage where they're doing their due diligence, they would go directly to the source, the vendors, and ask them to do the educating and allow for them to really build that business case earlier on in the process. And then perhaps go back, evaluate, narrow down the vendors to 3 or 4, bring you back, then again go through the validation process, narrow it down again to maybe 2, and then you finally win a deal. I'm not even talking about an RFP at this point. That's just the way deals often were in the past. And then, of course, you're all familiar with the RFI, RFP process. The way
Just
that that
just
has
stop there a
changed.
second, Jake. Go over those acronyms for a second, just for anyone who isn't
Yes.
familiar with that.
So an RFP is a request for purchase, or an RFI is a request for information. It's a buyer stating that we have interest in solutions that could solve X problem. How do you believe that you fit into this box that we have painted? Um, that we want you to define yourself within this box. There's a challenge there. I'll get back to that in a minute. But if any of you have experienced that, you know that it's not the most exciting thing when you get a request, because now all of a sudden you've got to scramble, do a lot of work for a deal that the likelihood of winning is low. Um, so where that's changing now is that the buyer is able to self-educate way earlier on in the process. Now there's a statistic that we're all kind of familiar with, maybe even questioning the data on, but regardless, the point is that buyers are more educated along the buying process now. You know, some data points say that they're 60% of the way through the buying process before they even contact a vendor. Or they might say that they're close to 60% of the way through their self-educating before they pick up the phone and contact a vendor. Either way, the concept is they are doing their homework and due diligence in ways they never did before they ever pick up the phone. And how are they doing it? They're doing it on social media. They're using Twitter or LinkedIn groups, and they're asking their peers, they're asking others in the industry. They're perhaps venting and complaining about their current vendor online. They're educating just by going online and selecting and searching. There's all kinds of software cloud marketplaces today that never existed before, and so they can just go simply shop for your software, and you will never even know until a partner sells it for you, right? And so what's happening now is that before they ever even pick up the phone, they're doing their due diligence. The interesting stat here that we need to be paying more attention to is one that CEB, or Corporate Executive Board, showed us in a recent study, where the key point where we need to be impacting our buyer is 37% of the way through that journey, not the 60%. 37% of the way through that journey is where the peak of group buying dysfunction occurs. And maybe we need to stop and break what that means down. But the point is, 37% of the way through their buying or their procurement phase, they go through what is called a due diligence phase. And they're learning, they're educating, they're doing all these things that we're talking about, but they're also defining what their own problem is. And this is when they start painting their box that we talked about, right?
Let me jump in here before we go any further, because you're on a roll there, so I didn't want to interrupt. But come back to this 37%. It feels like a good title for a book. That the 37% something sales is something that would sell. So we'll come back to the second.
I've been working on a blog post. Don't worry, it'll be coming out soon.
Good stuff. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes over at salesman.red. And Jake, I want to just frame this, because you've got half the audience going, oh no, everything's changed, I don't know how I'm going to keep up. You've got the other half of the audience going, change is the potential for opportunity. And
Yes.
if my competitors aren't doing this, I've got a real good in and insight with this show and other things that we both talk about to get a leg up here. How do you see this personally? Do you see this change and perhaps the increase in due diligence and the lack of control over the content that people are consuming to do that due diligence? Do you see that as an opportunity, or do you see it as a problem for a sales professional?
I see it to both, and I'll explain that. Huge opportunity. Anytime someone moves the cheese, right? Not to be cheesy, you like the pun there, but anytime someone changes a process or that cheese moves, there's a huge opportunity to be the first person to say, I'm going to go find it. I'm going to go get it. I'm going to figure it out, because you're going to beat your competition there. That's a massive opportunity for you and your market. The other part of why it's a challenge is for everyone who stays behind and continues to sell in the same old way, begins to complicate the market, begins to oversaturate it, begins to start spreading best practice or poor practices of sales that hurt and damage the rest of us in the industry are trying to keep up with best practices. And so the challenge is an opportunity, but also requires all of us to level up our game and And we owe it to each other as sales professionals to always be working towards the best practice. Otherwise, we're screwing it up for everyone else. And I don't want to be known for staying behind and doing old sales tactic. It sticks out like a sore thumb and doesn't make a lot of people very happy.
Sure. And I mean, and you'll probably agree with this, Jacob. I will do an old sales tactic if it works. I think that's the crux to all of this. But clearly, if there's opportunities there and things are going to work better, you'd be crazy not to explore them.
Absolutely.
And on this, just before we dive into this 37, I'm going to call it the 37% rule, because I feel like this is going to be the crux of the conversation here. Can you explain, and this might tie into this point as well, but why are there more? Why is the trending and why is the trend to continue, perhaps from some of the data that I've read, that there's going to be more decision makers within the process, referring back to all the changes that you just mentioned then?
So you're asking me, why are there more decision makers getting involved in the process now?
Yeah.
I think it's because I guess I can explain it best with an article I recently read by Jacko, if you know who Jacko is. He recently kind of described how the buying procurement process in B2P enterprise is more flat than it used to be. So you used to maybe have one or two decision makers that would report up to some sort of a VP or global VP or whatever, president, and they would bring their business case and that decision would be made at maybe at that higher level. There were definitely still multiple people involved, but it was kind of more hierarchical than it is now. Now I see it being more flat. They don't have time anymore to be involved in those decision-making processes. In fact, what you'll see is your signer most likely will be engaged early on in the sale, and then they'll back out as they hand off the responsibility to the person in charge of driving the implementation. Then they'll get back involved towards the end of the deal as it needs to get signed, right? And so in the meantime, there are more people involved in this committee of evaluating and implementing because there are multiple decision makers that your technology is probably impacting more now than it ever was. We're just more integrated than we used to be. Our technologies overlap. There's more convergence between sales and marketing and other departments. And so I think that decision making is more flat, and then more people have a stake in what the impact is going to be on their business.
And how do we know who the decision makers are? And I don't know the answer to this question. And my experience has always been you kind of put it out there, you know who the end decision maker is, and then you're kind of rallying the troops as you go along. That doesn't seem to be the smart way to go about it, though. Is there a way to suss out who the decision makers are ahead of time so that then you can, when you're talking about a committee rather than just one or two people, so then you can perhaps get in front of them, add value and all the cool stuff that's happening in the sales world at the moment?
Yeah, that's a key question. Sometimes the most complicated problems have the most simple answers. And I think that this is a fundamental issue that sales just fails to do. It's as simple as tying your shoes right. It's asking the question properly. I think two areas where most sales reps are challenged with right now is that understanding how to ask the right questions in the right time to the right person is a skill. It's a talent, it's an art, but you have to do it right. And then I think understanding how to follow up with that and understanding the way procurement is done. And so the one thing I always do is I ask very clear questions around who are others that are impacted by this goal or this initiative that we're talking about. How does this impact their business? How do they need to be involved in this process? At what stage do we need to get involved in? And then the other question I ask that's very key, and you can learn a lot, is asking them, what is the procurement process or culture like within your company? Help me understand how procurement is done, because that will open up your eyes to quirks or steps that either you may not be comfortable with or familiar with, or may not have to even worry about. So asking questions, one, is key.
And just
There's another. Go ahead.
before you move on from this, I want to get real practical with this, Jake. What words would you literally use on a phone conversation with the initial decision maker, perhaps, to get those to put those questions across? What would you literally say word for word?
Yeah, actually, just like I said, I would say something effective. Okay, we just talked about these goals. So first you have to understand what goals and what initiatives are tied to revenue and how this person is being measured against those, right? Because what makes them tick? What are they going to be evaluated on? What are they going to be fired on? Then once you know those things, say, all right, who else within the organization, within your sales organization or within your revenue organization are tied to these goals and initiatives that have a stake in making this decision, right? Get those names and then say, how do we need to include them in this procurement process moving forward? And then they might inform you at this point, well, I'm just at the early stage, I'm evaluating, then I'll pull them in. Or they might tell you, that they haven't gone that far. The thing is here, you'll also learn if the buyer is just kicking tires with you, or if they're hoarding the solution to themselves, because that's an interesting concept. Sometimes they don't want to get others involved because they want to be the one to present the solution and it looks good on them. That doesn't always work because then you're talking only about a me problem, not a we problem that you're solving. So I very clearly ask, and then I very clearly ask the question, help me understand the procurement process or culture within your organization from beginning to end. What steps need to be taken? In my experience, we need to go through some sort of a proof of concept. We need to go through the business case. We need to go through financing approval. We need to go through InfoSec review. We need to go through legal red lines. What else am I missing? And let them fill in those gaps, because otherwise you're just going to assume you're going through their process and you're wasting time.
You also mentioned asking about quirks in the process. I'll give an example of this in a second, but what pops up or what has popped up with your experience of asking that question?
Yeah. So, for example, one quirk that comes up sometimes is sometimes InfoSec or info security will always ask, when it comes to their phase, they'll ask, have you completed a proof of concept or a trial? It's just a natural question that they're going to ask. And if you've ever been in a conversation where you have built the business case, you've done everything you need to do, and you get to that point and you just need the info security team to sign off on it, and they ask that question on a call and you haven't, and your buyer didn't care about it, and all of a sudden now they're like, no, we haven't. Maybe we should. Hey, Jake, can we do that really quick? That throws you back. It throws everybody back. And if you would have known that was a quirk for their organization, something that they require, you could have saved a lot of time.
Definitely. An example from me, is a brilliant question to ask, and I would probably get the response through being empathetic and understanding the person talking to me and have a good relationship with them, and have them just tell me rather than me proactively ask them. But I've been in situations before in the medical device world where you'll have your list of decision makers from similar to how you just described, of if you've got hospital data going back and forth, IT need to be involved, they don't talk very well to anyone else, and it's going back and forth, and you've got theatre management, you've got procurement, you've got the surgeons themselves, who you would think on the surface of things, the surgeons would essentially get what they want, but they don't. Seems as they're performing life-saving surgery, and you need the best equipment that they've been trained on and all that stuff. And a bunch of times there'll be a theatre nurse, there'll be someone low down the food chain of the decision-making process who will say, hey, this person, you need to get them on board, you need to get them on board. You don't need to bother with them. They've got big mouths. They don't really have any decisions making power. We don't really like them. We don't really listen to anything they say. Right. So then you can kind of get them on board. If they don't come on board, you know that it's not the end of the world and you don't have to focus a whole bunch of time on them. And yeah, I thought that was a really interesting twist. I've not heard anyone mention that specific question to ask before. And as I said, it's something that I would uncover, but not proactively. So I think that's really useful for the audience. And Jake, coming back to the 37% point, I think we've built up a bit of hype around this point now. Do you mind if I actually share the other area where I feel like we can impact discovering the committee? Because I think there's another part of this is really key that there's a lot of skepticism around right now, is the simple concept of social selling. For some people it's a buzzword, for others it's just a part of their process. And I think we need to know that with the way the landscape is evolving, part of evolving with their buyer is being where they are when they're there and being inside of their ecosystem and
if we're not utilizing social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever, wherever your buyer would be, if it's Pinterest, I don't care. If you're there, then you're listening and you're understanding what they're talking about. And so there's a great way to leverage social media to also discover who are other stakeholders in your buying committee or buying process. And so don't discount that if you're a skeptic.
And conceptualize that for us, Jake. Is this, because I know where you're going with this, and which is good, and I agree with it, but there'll be a lot of people listening going, why does retweeting the CFO when he posts the blog post that he's written that isn't very good anyway, that's social selling? Why does that really make a difference? Tell us what you mean by social selling in this context and how it can lead to more information about the decision makers.
Well, first, it's just identifying who they are. So you can find who these different people are faster just by doing your own due diligence. So one, it's identifying them. Two, then it's engaging them in a very light way to start nurturing that person. Let them know that you're there, right? I'm not here to sell you. I'm not going to connect with you on Twitter or LinkedIn and then immediately jam a sales pitch down your throat. Don't do that. If you're listening to me right now, please stop inviting me to connect on LinkedIn and then sending me 10 seconds later an automated sales pitch. That's not how it works. But it's including yourself in my professional ecosystem network and adding value. If you're adding value back to me, if you're engaging me with relevant content, if you're getting involved in conversations that I'm getting involved in and what you have to say is meaningful, if you're supporting me in what I'm passionate about that might not be just necessarily sales, but maybe something I blog about that's a personal interest of mine. If you're adding value, there's so many other ways. Maybe it's just even connecting your buyer with leads. Jack Kosakowski is someone I learned that from, is pay a lot of attention to how you can add pipeline to your potential customers' pipeline. That's a cool concept. So it's adding value, not necessarily trying to beg for the conversation. And that is, I think, where you open a lot of doors. That is where I have opened a lot of doors.
Definitely. And I know you've used it and everyone uses it and it's an industry term, but I hate the term adding value. Could we swap adding value in this context of perhaps framing yourself as an industry expert and just being on their radar?
Totally. I mean, yeah, that's, the simple term is add value, but again, that's another word that's kind of become a buzz term. But it's definitely becoming a resource, framing yourself as someone who has something insightful to offer. And if that's being a thought leader, then absolutely.
Definitely. Okay, let's wrap up the show with what happens in the buying process at seemingly this very precise number of 37%.
Yeah, so it's interesting. CEB, again, they did great research here, and it's an article that I recommend you go take a look at. But that they find that at this stage during the buying process, right around the 37% is where your potential buyer is educating themselves. They're doing their own due diligence. They're researching the industry. They're trying to discover really what their problem is. They haven't necessarily defined it yet. And so they're trying to essentially self-diagnose. Where we all know that if we go to our doctor and we've already self-diagnosed on WebMD, that's not necessarily always the best thing, right? So they're self-diagnosing. And the way they self-diagnose is they start building a box, right? And that box is based on the terms or the definition in which they think their problem is defined and they think that the potential solution is defined. That's when, by the time you talk to them at 60% of the way through the journey or whatever, is when you end up in a conversation trying to battle against a competitor, or you're talking about pricing, or you're in an RFP or RFI. But if you can be a part of helping them build that box, helping them define that definition of a problem and a solution, then guess what? You fit right inside. Otherwise, you have to fit in someone else's box, right? And so it's very important to be involved earlier stages in the funnel so that we're educating them during that stage of them defining what the problem and the solution would be. So then we can help them understand as they go through their process that we are the real source of insight, or we are the thought leaders here. That the only ones that can provide the solution that we've helped them define, right? Otherwise, you're just educating your buyer to purchase a competing product, and that's not the right way to do it.
And to add a bit of context through this, we used to do this all the time. The medical device company I worked at, well, both of them used to do it. So I moved from one to the biggest competitor. And of course, every product has a unique selling point, whether it be the endoscopes I sold, whether it be the diameter of them, whether it be the clarity, whether it be the camera system does certain things. A big one for a long time, this sounds ridiculous, was one camera system was 1080p progressive. For all the nerds out there, they'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. For anyone else, they may not. Progressive means that the image is portrayed on the screen frame by frame by frame. The competitor was interlaced, which means that they would have one line of the image before, and then the next line of the image next, and it would go back and forth. And so the image quality wasn't as high on the 1080i as it was for the 1080p. I probably just lost half the audience here. But this was a unique selling point. And so we would get in with the surgeons, take our camera system in there and convince them that they need 1080p when in reality they could perform the surgery on either one. But then when the NHS in the UK, the National Health Service, when they would go to tender, on the tender documents, it would always be 1080p. No one else could compete and we'd win the business by default. Of course, you didn't win it by default. You won it by a bunch of pre-sales and educating, legwork, dragging a camera system around multiple hospitals around the UK to do it. But you're loading up the effort and the energy up front, so the close happens naturally at the other end. Jake,
that's perfect. That's exactly it.
And that was just trial and error. That wasn't. There's no great skill in uncovering this. It was just something that we noticed and we could leverage as a tool. But for the salesperson listening to this, because I don't know if they can personally, but how do they educate the buyer so that they can come up with their own examples similar to what I've just described? Is this something that an individual salesperson can do, or is this something that the company needs to do through marketing material so that when someone Googles endoscopic camera system, they are on the company's website, if that makes sense, through content marketing?
Yeah. Yes, both need to happen. One, the sales rep can always influence this process. If they're doing their part to always be involved and not just waiting around for some sort of a junior rep to feed them opportunities, then absolutely, because they can be out there using social media, social selling, being proactive, reaching out to potential buyers and personalizing content and delivering that content at the right time so that they're getting in earlier in the phase. They need to have a way to provide personalized content so that buyers can make decisions and take control of what they want to learn about. Therefore, they can make informed decisions faster. So that also requires convergence and proper SLA communication between the sales and marketing division. If you can communicate well and beautifully and provide assets that a rep can personalize, I think we need to get away from, and we can then get away from a lot of the fluff content that we're starting to see in the market, where reps, companies, everyone's feeling like we just need to be loud. And so there's a lot of fluff content that they're producing, when in reality, we need to be precise and we need to be more targeted and provide insight in very specific areas of challenges that our buyers might be dealing with so that we hit them with relevant content when they need to hear it.
Very practically here, because this is something that I'm sure you'll have great insights on, but no one else has nailed who's come on the show. If you've got a huge market, it's, SaaS software, generally there's hundreds of companies you could be dealing with versus 10 that you could keep on top of the individuals within the potential decision makers. If you've got a big market to go at, how do you track, trace, get in conversations with people, and how do you prioritize that market when it seems to me that it's difficult to know until you've spent quite a bit of time and you've invested time into the decision makers within the company? It's very difficult to know where they are in the buying cycle and if they're even in a buying cycle and looking for the kind of solution to their problems at all. Because, of course, I don't know, there's a cliche statistic, I can't remember off the top of my head, of essentially, so much of your pipeline will buy in the next 5 years, so much will buy now, and very, very few percent of them are actively looking to be closed. How do you go about when you've got seemingly hundreds of people to go at? How do you know where you should be spending? How do you know where the people are at 37%? How do you know when they're there?
A company that has been around for, let's just say, at least 3 years of 2 to 3 years of data, then the answer is simple as it's data. If you have done your job to track your sales with some sort of a CRM and track your process, then it's time to go in and take a look at your historical data and understand who your ideal customer profile is. How often are they closing? What industries? So it comes down to data, and there's a whole conversation around that. But if you have history and you've been tracking it, then you can find it because it's left clues for you. If you're going to market in a brand new business, and I've done this twice now, a lot of it is based on assumptions. A lot of it's based on product validation, touring conversations, getting it in front of people, getting feedback, getting it to a point where people are telling you they're ready to buy. And so you know where you need to be focusing your attention. Then you can also there's a lot of research out there now. I mean, you can go to Gartner, you can go to CEB, you can go to any one of these great resources and know most likely where you have a higher propensity of having success. Then you come up with your plan, you come up with a very precise plan, and be willing to quickly abandon your false assumptions. Because the biggest challenge that we have in sales and in marketing is that we have a hard time killing our darlings because we put a lot of time into our assumptions, we've put our neck on the line with our projections, and we don't want to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong, but you have to be able to pivot quickly and refocus. So to me, if it's early on, it would be coming up with a solid plan and then quickly be willing to kind of evolve that and let go of things that you're seeing you're just not having traction.
I want to wrap up this part of the show, Jake, with a question that I don't know honestly what you're going to say to this, and it's 50-50 with the guests that come on the show of their thoughts on it all, depending on the size of the company, and there's all kinds of fundamental elements that could adjust and change this. But do you feel, from what you just said, salespeople should be experimenting, making hypotheses, and going out and proving or disproving them and refining the sales process? Or is that what sales leadership should be doing, and salespeople should be following a very rigid, time and tested process that gets revised every 5 years rather than every few months?
Boy, I might be passionate about this in a wrong way, or I don't know, but who's your front line? Who's talking to your customer more than anybody else? Who's getting the most amount of feedback? Right? In my opinion, if you're not enabling and allowing your sellers and coaching them to take feedback and to provide that feedback in a process in which they can go back to management and marketing and to others that can filter it and then help come up with a plan, then you're missing out on a huge opportunity. These are your guys and girls that are out there having the most relevant conversations on a daily basis. Need to empower them to bring that insight back. I think an organization that is even aligning product to sales and customer success is going to be the way of the future of sales.
Love it. I'm so happy you said that, because that's how I feel about it as well. Of course, I'm slightly biased being a B2B sales professional myself and loving and breathing this rather than the leadership side of things. But I think you're spot on. I think you've got the relationships there, which are way deeper than what customer service or anyone like that has. And you've probably got the opportunity for a salesperson to ask questions where you'll get a candid answer from the customer versus they might just push off and be polite to other people if a questionnaire comes over or anything like that. So good stuff. Right. I appreciate that. I've got a few questions, Jake, that ask everyone that comes on the show. As someone who's listened to the show, you probably have some thoughts on these already. But first one, what is one book or resource that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
A book that I've been going back to a lot recently is, I really have liked the Sales Acceleration Formula by Mark Roberge. I think that it gives some very, very clear what to do instead of all the how to do. Sorry, vice versa. It's the how to do versus the what to do books that we've been reading. Spelling it out is very insightful. And then I also think the Sales Playbook by Trish Bertuzzi is killer. Again, spelling out the how to do as opposed to just the what to do.
Nice. And we'll include them in the show notes over at salesman.red. Jake, dollar size if possible, what's the biggest deal you've ever closed?
Oh, geez. I used to be in the med device space just like you, and worked multiple hospital systems. And the biggest deal I ever worked on took me a year and probably about 15 months total across multiple hospital systems, and it was about $2.5 million contract.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Who is the world's greatest salesperson?
My 8-year-old son.
What? Why? Give us an example of how he sold you.
Oh, the kid knows how to manipulate and get his way with dad more than anybody else. So to me, I'm learning sales tactics from him every day. Joking aside, that is a hard question. I think that we could look into every aspect of life. So I don't know if I have a direct answer for you on that, but there are a lot of people who inspire me, and that's what I love about sales is that there's not one single source of knowledge. That I think that if we just take time to listen to the people who are actually doing, that we'll learn a lot as opposed to the people who profess. And I think that to me is the greatest source of knowledge right now.
Definitely, and I'm glad you said that, Jake, because the audience will probably have noticed this by the time your show comes out, Jake, that I'm making a shift of, or perhaps not a shift, just including more practitioners like yourself rather than just authors who, I joke about this quite flippantly, but there's a lot of people, and we've had some of them on the show, that wrote a book 15 years ago and now just speak about sales, make a crap ton of money from speaking. But
Yeah.
it's perhaps less relevant than someone like yourself who comes on the show who is wearing your company's t-shirt, like logo on your t-shirt. That is clearly a practitioner in the space who is able to implement things and give real time feedback in this time of change in the sales industry. So I appreciate that, Jake. And final
Yeah.
one, mate, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help become better at selling?
To learn how to manage your time wisely. Don't get distracted and don't allow yourself to mismanage and all these different things that aren't high priority. Learn how to manage your time, and you'll be more successful earlier on in your career.
How do we know what's high priority for a salesperson? Is it as simple as number of leads coming in your pipeline?
No, I've learned that that's not always the highest priority. It's a number of things that sometimes it's setting the table. Sometimes it's taking the time to set the table properly, to get all the processes in place, to map out your systems, to get your stack put together well, and then go hunt and eat. Sometimes we don't have the luxury to take that time, and so you have to do it in parallel. But I think that if you manage your time wisely and understand what are high priority and high urgency tasks and versus low priority or spending the first half of your day just responding to emails, you'll get more done.
Definitely, definitely. And with that, Jake, I want you to tell us a little bit more about Consensus and tell us a little bit where we can find out perhaps a bit more about you as well.
Sure. So Consensus is a video solution. Quite simply, we allow for personalization in video so that sellers can send a customized link to a buyer, and a buyer, whether it's through email or through your website, can actually provide the feedback in the video and interact with it to then select the messaging or the insight that they're going to receive. It's almost like the choose your own adventure books we used to love growing up. So by the time they select their persona and say what they care about, our platform will curate the content in the video that they need to see that's most relevant to them. And so it's a big thing that we focus on is personalization and buying acceleration, because then also our platform allows your buyer who you are now mobilizing or educating to go socialize. It enables them with the content they need to personalize that message to each individual stakeholder in a way that they individually care about it, and they can watch in their own time, in their own way, and in their own leisure, because it's on demand. And then the beauty is that we capture the insights from those, the feedback, so that the seller now has relevant insight to start a meaningful conversation with a buyer and not just have your traditional discovery call. But I can jump on a call and say, hey, here's where I know you all are aligned. And here's where I see that there's misalignment. Let's talk about this. that is a much more valuable conversation to a buyer's time than the way we've traditionally gone about it. So that's what we offer. We accelerate the deal cycle. We reduce we reduce the cycle time. We increase sales sizes. And the biggest thing is we help you discover who all the decision makers are too, so that you can work individually with all of them to make that decision.
Nice. And that's over at goconsensus.com.
Goconsensus.com, and check us out. We have our experience it for yourself on our website, because you'll go through the journey yourself by just watching our video.
Amazing stuff. With that, Jake, I want to thank you for your time, mate. You are more likely to come back on in the near future to dive into some of this further, because there's plenty of rabbit holes that we could have gone down in this episode. And I just want to thank you for your time, your energy, mate, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Awesome. Thank you.
And there we have it. Jake, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your time. We'll have you back on in the near future to dive into this further, because I really enjoy having practitioners on the show who are actively experimenting with all of this. Thank you, Sales Nation. I say it every episode. I mean it, guys. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for sharing this with your colleagues. And with that all said, I'll speak with you on tomorrow's episode.